Alright guys, so this is going to be a video just reviewing all the causes of evolution that we've been talking about for the past few weeks. I want to make sure you guys understand these, hopefully the best you can before the state test rolls around. Anytime you see a little cloud up here in the top left or right corner that says write this in your notes, make sure you write it down on the page that goes with this, letter G, and then once the video is done, you'll move on to letter F. So what are the causes of evolution? So just keep in mind that these are specific events that cause the trait specifically or the allele frequencies to change in a species population from one generation to the next. So what that means is that the trait itself, like fur color, would change from one generation to the next, or maybe the allele itself, the big B dominant versus the little b recessive, will change over time through the generations. So there were 5 mechanisms that we learned about: mutations, natural selection, gene flow, sexual selection, and genetic drift. These are, for the most part, in order of how we learned them. I think we learned genetic drift before sexual selection. Actually, no, they're a little out of order, but they match your paper. Either way, you need to know all 5 of them. So this is a little cloud box I was telling you about, so make sure you write this down in the box on your paper that says mutations. And so just as a reminder for you guys, mutations are a change in the DNA that potentially leads to a trait change. Keep in mind that I say potentially because sometimes they don't actually do anything, like a silent mutation. These mutations can be harmful, can be neutral, or can be helpful. So if we think about the mice, if they didn't turn black. If the mutation that made the new baby mice black, if they lived on the black background, that was obviously helpful, but if they lived on the white background, then that was harmful. And perhaps it could be neutral depending on if they lived in a totally different area. And so the example here is that we have this strand of DNA and we get a tan mouse from it, but if we have a mutation where this T right here changes to a C, then we get a black mouse. And remember that depending on where they live and what the environment's like, this could be beneficial, harmful, or neutral. All right, the next thing we learned about was natural selection. Make sure you write this in your natural selection box. So the organism with the best fitness in its environment will survive and pass on beneficial traits. So remember that fitness just means how well is an organism suited to its environment. If they're well suited, they will obviously survive and pass on their traits. If they're not well suited, then they will not survive and not pass on their traits. And so sticking with the mouse example, because the mouse is what we use to talk about natural selection, the tan mice on the tan background obviously had very good camouflage, and so didn't get eaten by the predators, so they were able to pass on that tan trait. However, the black mice stood out on the tan background, and their lack of camouflage likely leads to death. Now, if I was to switch the background of this slide, then obviously the tan mice would have a disadvantage, while the black mice would have an advantage. All right, the next one is gene flow. So movement in and out of a population. So remember that immigration means moving in. Try to think the I for in and I for immigration. And then emigration is moving out. I like to think E for emigration, E for exit. They are exiting the area. And this obviously leads to genes moving in between populations. And so, for example, if we look at this population here, there's more green organisms compared to black, but depending on which ones move from this population to this new population, that's going to change the number of black or green organisms. All right, after that we learned about sexual selection. If you guys recall, there was 2 different types of sexual selection that we learned about. So we learned about female choice, where fancy males are typically selected by females and therefore pass on the fancy traits. Remember that this is not in a territory type situation. This is when food is just spread out, and so the males have to do something to get the attention of the females. Try to think about the birds on that island that we watched that were all fancy and dancing. And then male-male competition, males obviously fight each other for control of a territory, and the females that happen to be in said territory. And so the example I gave here, so this plain green male over here isn't going to be highly sought after by any females. However, if they can fight really well, so this whatever you want to call it has antlers where it can fight well, or if it's extra fancy, it's going to get the attention of a female more so than this plain guy over here. After that, remember that genetic drift has 2 different types to it. So the first one, and I did separate them into different boxes. The first one is genetic drift bottleneck effect. So remember that in the bottleneck, something something wipes out a large portion of the population for at least one generation. So examples could include natural disasters, diseases, human introduction into the area, but ultimately something that relates back to genetic drift, whether it's bottleneck or founders, is this right here. The reduced genetic diversity is a key to this situation. And then, so if we look at our example here, we had a initial population where this red glob got wiped out from something. And so in the initial population, there was more green organisms, but considering these random ones got wiped out, the new population happened to have more black ones, but also just reduced genetic diversity in general because now there's only 3 of them compared to 3, 6, 9 of them. And then the other type of genetic drift was the founder effect. So remember that a small number of the original population basically just find a new place to live. They could find a new island, move into a valley, move on top of a mountain range, past the mountain range. Also keep in mind that these things can actually make it harder for the majority of the old population to get to this new place. And as I mentioned on the last slide, reduced genetic diversity is part of genetic drift. And so in this example, we can see on our original island over here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 organisms again, still mostly green, but depending on which ones actually leave, we may end up seeing more black individuals, but also reduced genetic diversity in general because only 3 of them made it to the new island. And so all of these causes for evolution can lead to things like speciation. So if you want to go ahead and flip your paper over, we're going to touch on speciation again real quick, and then we'll be done with this video. So remember that speciation is basically just a creation of new species. So when you have enough change and separation between organisms, new species can emerge, and that's called speciation. And so make sure you write this down on the left side of the paper. The example here, which you will actually see as a question on the Edulastic, is showing that in California we have this massive valley here down the middle that has separated these little salamanders from each other. And so over a long period of time, as they move down California's coast and other side of it, they are getting so different from each other to the point that they're actually considered new species. So they may kind of look similar here and there, but they actually most likely can't reproduce with each other anymore. And especially not the ones that have been separated by the valleys. So this Xanthoptica here definitely could not mate with Plantensis over here. And so when do we consider them different species? Usually we can tell when it's become a new species is when the 2 different groups can either won't or can't mate. And if they do mate, the offspring tend to be sterile, aka can't have their own kids, or have a lower fitness survival rate, right? So wolves versus dogs, 2 different species. They can mate, but honestly, the only reason that wolf dogs survive well is because of humans. If a wolf dog was out in the wild, it would have a lower fitness than wolves by themselves or dogs by themselves. Other animals, I mean, I just gave you an example. These organisms will no longer mate with each other, and if they do, they won't have viable offspring that can have their own kids. Okay, and so remember that there's 3 different barriers that can lead to speciation. We have geographic barriers, make sure you put this in your notes. So some sort of land or physical barrier separates the organisms. So examples could include valleys, mountains. We talked about that one sunlight example with the plants. You could have behavioral barriers where organisms either act so different or they court with each other differently. That means they're trying to get each other's mates. They're so different that they just won't breed together anymore. And so different smells, different dancing, or different sounds are going to be examples of behavioral. And then finally, temporal is all about the timing of the organism, and it just doesn't line up with the other one. So maybe they're a day versus night kind of organism, or maybe their mating seasons are fall versus spring. And they're just so different that they don't line up enough to be able to mate together. Okay, so keep in mind, we have 5 different things that can lead, sorry, a little ridiculous. We have 5 different things that can lead to evolution happening in a variation of ways. And all of these things could eventually lead to speciation happening as well.